Before we begin, a warm welcome to this channel, a place for quiet storytelling, deep history, and narrated journeys into the past. If you find these long-form documentaries relaxing or insightful, consider subscribing, liking, or commenting. It helps others discover these stories too. I thank you for your support. Now, let's step back in time. In the decades before the plague, the Greek world stood in a fragile balance. Athens had risen to power through its navy and its leadership of the Delian League, a network of allied city-states spread across the Aegean. Tribute from these allies funded fleets, walls, temples, and public works. The city became wealthy, confident, and influential. But this growing power concerned many Greek states, especially Sparta. Where Athens embraced trade, innovation, and democracy, Sparta valued tradition, discipline, and military restraint. To Spartan leaders, Athens appeared increasingly ambitious and unpredictable. Tensions grew through the 430s BC. Disputes between Corinth and Corcyra, conflicts with Megara, and disagreements over alliances pushed both sides closer to open conflict. Diplomats attempted compromise, but mistrust had taken root. Sparta believed Athens was expanding beyond its proper sphere. Athens, meanwhile, feared Spartan intervention in its affairs. By 431 BC, war seemed unavoidable. When the conflict began, Sparta used its greatest strength, land warfare. Each campaigning season, Spartan forces marched into Attica, destroying crops and pressuring Athens to fight. But Pericles, the leading statesman of Athens, refused to meet them in open battle. Instead, he relied on the city's strongest assets, its walls and its navy. Athenians withdrew behind the long walls, a fortified corridor stretching from the city to the port of Piraeus. These walls allowed Athens to remain supplied by sea, even while enemy forces roamed the countryside. The strategy demanded sacrifice. Families left rural homes and crowded into the city. Public buildings became shelters, open spaces filled with huts and temporary dwellings. The population density rose to levels Athens had never experienced. Yet most citizens trusted the plan. The long walls had made Athens strong, and the navy connected the city to distant sources of food and materials. Many believed the strategy would protect them from the Spartans. None imagined that the greatest danger would not come from armies or burned farmland, but from an unseen illness already moving quietly through the crowds. Pericles' strategy lay at the heart of Athens' early confidence. He understood that Sparta held the advantage on land, while Athens dominated the sea. Rather than risk a major battle in the open countryside, Pericles urged citizens to abandon their farms and withdraw behind the long walls. These fortifications stretched nearly 6 kilometers, connecting Athens to the port of Piraeus. Together, city and harbor became a single fortified zone. As long as the navy controlled the sea, Athens could survive even if Attica itself was ravaged. This plan demanded patience and sacrifice. Rural communities emptied as families moved into the city. Thucydides wrote that many had no proper lodging and slept in cramped, makeshift spaces. Open areas, temples, and workshops became shelters. The rapid rise in population put pressure on water supplies and sanitation. But most Athenians trusted the logic of the strategy. The walls had saved the city before, and they believed the same would happen again. The port of Piraeus became a lifeline. Ships brought grain from the Black Sea, goods from Egypt, and supplies from across the Aegean. Yet this constant traffic also brought contact with distant regions. Athens was now connected to the wider Mediterranean more intensely than ever before. Goods, sailors, traders, and travelers flowed through Piraeus each day. Historians believe that this movement increased the city's exposure to foreign diseases. Thucydides noted that the earliest cases of the plague appeared in Piraeus, where symptoms struck sailors arriving from distant ports. Athens had prepared itself for a long war, but the conditions created by Pericles' defensive plan, high density, international contact, and environmental stress, set the stage for a disaster no one expected. The first signs of the illness appeared without fanfare. Sailors arriving in Piraeus experienced unusual fevers, headaches, and a burning sensation behind the eyes. At first, these symptoms drew little concern. Fevers were common among crews traveling long distances under harsh weather. Eye irritation and sore throats were often signs of exhaustion. But within days, similar symptoms appeared among those who had not traveled, including workers in the port and residents of the nearby districts. The disease moved quietly at first, touching scattered households. Families cared for the sick in close quarters, allowing the illness to spread quickly. Many developed sudden intense heat in the head. Others suffered from redness of the eyes and inflammation of the throat. Thucydides later described how the illness advanced rapidly, often overwhelming patients before physicians could respond. What puzzled observers was that the symptoms did not match any disease known in Athens. Treatments that normally relieved fever or respiratory discomfort had no effect. As the number of cases increased, the disease moved beyond Piraeus and into the city. The narrow streets and crowded shelters provided ideal conditions for transmission. People lived close together, using shared water sources and relying on makeshift facilities. The early summer heat added further strain. Within a short time, the illness reached every part of Athens. Still, the war occupied much of the city's attention. News of military maneuvers, speeches in the assembly, and the annual Spartan invasion remained central concerns. Many citizens viewed the rising sickness as an unfortunate side effect of cramped living conditions. Yet beneath the surface, the crisis was already growing faster than anyone understood. The first wave of the plague had taken hold, and its full force had not yet been felt. Thucydides remains the most important source for understanding the Plague of Athens. As a general and historian, he experienced the outbreak firsthand and survived it. His description is precise, clinical, and at times strikingly modern in its detail. Historians often compare it to the work of a trained physician, though Thucydides wrote simply as a careful observer, determined to preserve the truth for future generations. He described how the illness began with sudden heat in the head and inflammation in the eyes. The throat and tongue grew red, and breath became difficult. Many suffered violent coughing. As the disease progressed, patients experienced stomach pain, vomiting, and rashes across the body. Thucydides noted that sufferers were tormented by an intense thirst, drinking constantly yet never finding relief. Restlessness made it impossible to sleep. Many died after days of exhaustion and delirium. Thucydides also described the unpredictable nature of the disease. Some died quickly, while others survived the early stages only to experience severe weakness afterward. A few who recovered developed memory loss, or the loss of extremities due to infection. Physicians, attempting to treat the sick, died in large numbers themselves. Their deaths contributed to early panic, as no one understood how the disease spread, or why some survived while others collapsed. Importantly, Thucydides did not attempt to identify the disease by name. Instead, he wrote so that future generations might compare his account to later outbreaks. Modern historians have proposed numerous theories: typhus, measles, smallpox, viral hemorrhagic fever, but none match his description perfectly. His record remains the clearest window into the horror of the event, conveying both the physical suffering and the psychological shock the city endured. Athens offered ideal conditions for a rapid and devastating outbreak. The defensive strategy that brought safety from Spartan armies also created unprecedented population density. Families who once lived miles apart now occupied the same narrow streets, sleeping in makeshift huts, tents, or borrowed spaces. Public wells and fountains served thousands of additional people each day. With limited sanitation and rising summer temperatures, disease spread swiftly. Thucydides observed that the sick lay in heaps in some shelters, and that healthy relatives caring for them often fell ill shortly afterward. This cycle repeated across the city. The close physical contact required for basic care allowed the illness to pass from one household to the next. Because the symptoms appeared quickly, many Athenians became contagious before realizing they were sick. The plague moved through neighborhoods in waves, overwhelming even those who tried to avoid crowded areas. Temples and sanctuaries, traditionally places of refuge, became centers of infection as desperate citizens gathered seeking relief. The port remained active, maintaining Athens's connection to the outside world, but ships also brought fresh carriers of disease. With no concept of quarantine, there was no meaningful way to slow the spread. By the time officials recognized the scale of the crisis, the illness had reached every district of the city. Each day brought new reports of families unable to care for their sick, of corpses left unattended, and of neighborhoods struggling to maintain order. The plague did not discriminate by wealth or status. Soldiers, workers, merchants, and politicians all suffered. Within weeks, Athens faced not only a medical emergency, but a deepening social and psychological crisis. As the plague spread, Athens soon realized that its physicians were unprepared for an illness of this intensity. Greek medical practice in the 5th century BC drew heavily from observation, balancing bodily humors and environmental theories. Treatments focused on lifestyle, diet, and remedies meant to restore harmony to the body. But the plague defied all familiar patterns. Medicines had no effect. Practices that normally reduced fever or inflammation failed completely. Thucydides wrote that the physicians were the first to die because they were constantly exposed to the sick. Their deaths removed the city's most experienced healers at the moment they were needed most. As fear increased, some medical practitioners refused to treat patients, while others tried untested methods in desperation. Nothing slowed the progress of the illness. The breakdown of medical knowledge also undermined public confidence. Athenians had trusted their city's intellectual traditions, philosophy, inquiry, and rational explanation. The failure of these systems created deeper anxiety. If neither physicians nor religious figures could offer guidance, where could people turn? The summer heat worsened conditions. Crowded shelters lacked airflow and cleanliness. Bodies weakened by stress, dehydration, and exhaustion were more vulnerable to infection. Travelers and migrants from rural Attica brought their own illnesses into the mix, complicating the situation further. Some historians suggest that the combination of close quarters, limited sanitation, and high humidity created an environment where secondary infections became common, increasing the fatality rate. Thucydides noted that even animals behaved strangely around the sick. Birds and scavengers avoided corpses, a detail that modern scholars interpret as a sign of the disease's severity or toxicity. Whether literal or symbolic, it indicates how unnatural the Athenians found the outbreak. Without effective treatments or understanding, Athens faced a medical collapse. The city that prided itself on knowledge now faced an enemy that ignored expertise, tradition, and reason. As the death toll rose, Athens began to lose not only its physicians but its social order. The city's systems depended on structure, ritual, and shared responsibilities. But the plague struck so quickly, and in so many places at once, that normal customs became impossible to maintain. Thucydides described scenes that shocked even hardened citizens. Families struggled to care for the sick, often falling ill themselves. Many houses became places of silent suffering, where bodies lay unattended because relatives had died or fled. Friends hesitated to visit one another, fearing infection. Public officials could not manage the scale of the crisis. The result was a slow, pervasive unraveling of civic life. Funeral practices collapsed first. Traditional rites required washing the body, preparing it with care, and conducting ceremonies with relatives and the community. But the sheer number of dead made this impossible. Corpses were left outside houses or on the streets until someone could remove them. Thucydides wrote that the living were overwhelmed by the magnitude of the calamity, and many placed the dead on any available pyre, even those prepared by strangers. This breakdown of funerary customs carried a deep psychological cost. Athenians believed that improper burial dishonored the dead and distressed their spirits. In the crisis, these values could no longer be upheld. Law and order weakened as well. Thucydides observed that some citizens began to act without regard for the usual moral constraints. With death everywhere, people questioned the purpose of restraint or long-term planning. Some indulged in reckless behavior, spending savings or taking property from abandoned homes. Others turned inward, focusing only on survival. Despite this collapse, acts of courage and compassion still occurred. Some Athenians risked their lives to care for strangers or neighbors. Those who survived infection often helped the sick, believing themselves immune. Their resilience became one of the few hopeful elements recorded in the crisis. The plague tested Athens not only physically but morally. It revealed the strength and fragility of a society built on shared customs, confronting a disaster unlike anything it had imagined. Religion shaped daily life in Athens. Temples, festivals, and sacrifices connected citizens to their gods and offered a sense of stability. But as the plague intensified, the city's spiritual foundation began to strain under the weight of fear and uncertainty. Many citizens sought refuge in temples, hoping divine protection would guard them from illness. Sanctuaries near the Agora and on the slopes of the Acropolis filled with families carrying what few belongings they had. Yet these sacred spaces, meant to inspire calm, became tightly packed shelters. Thucydides observed that the sick lay in temple precincts, seeking help that never arrived. The close quarters only accelerated the spread of disease. Religious leaders struggled to offer guidance. Prayers, sacrifices, and rituals produced no improvement. Oracles delivered vague messages that provided little comfort. As more citizens died, some interpreted the plague as punishment from the gods. Others believed the gods had abandoned Athens or were angered by the war. A few argued that the Spartans had invoked divine support, pointing to an oracle that predicted a great destruction during a time of conflict. The failure of religious practices to halt the plague eroded public trust. Athens was a city that valued both rational thought and religious tradition. Its citizens depended on the favor of the gods during moments of crisis. But as the death toll rose, people questioned the power of prayer and the meaning of ritual. Some abandoned religious observance altogether, convinced that nothing could change the course of events. Modern historians interpret this crisis of belief as part of a broader social fracture. When traditional systems fail, whether political, medical, or spiritual, societies often experience deep psychological turmoil. In Athens, the collapse of religious confidence marked a turning point. The plague had not only devastated the body of the city, but struck at its spirit as well. Pericles had guided Athens for decades with steady leadership, strategic vision, and public confidence. But the plague struck at the heart of his political authority. His defensive strategy had forced citizens into cramped spaces, where the disease spread rapidly. Though he could not have predicted the outbreak, many Athenians blamed him for the conditions that allowed it to flourish. Facing rising anger, Pericles delivered a speech to the assembly, urging unity. He reminded citizens that Athens had survived hardship before, and that abandoning the war would destroy its credibility among allies. Thucydides recorded this speech, noting Pericles' effort to steady the city's resolve. Yet the mood had changed. Grief, exhaustion, and fear made it difficult for citizens to accept his call for perseverance. Pericles himself suffered deeply during the outbreak. The plague claimed several of his closest family members, including his sons. These losses affected him profoundly. Thucydides wrote that Pericles maintained his composure, but those around him saw the strain. His political opponents intensified their criticism, proposing fines and accusing him of mismanagement. The city that once admired him now questioned his leadership. Despite the pressure, Pericles refused to alter his strategy. He believed the city must continue relying on its walls and navy, and that changing course during crisis would weaken Athens further. However, the emotional toll proved too great. Shortly after his final speech, Pericles contracted the illness himself. Thucydides described his decline with uncharacteristic emotion, noting the impact his death had on the city. With Pericles gone, Athens lost its most stable political figure. Leadership passed to men who lacked his discipline and long-term vision. The plague had not only killed thousands of citizens, it had removed the one person capable of guiding Athens through the war with clarity and restraint. The plague struck Athens at a critical moment in the Peloponnesian War. The city depended on its navy, fleet crews, and citizen soldiers to maintain its advantage. But as the illness spread, manpower dwindled. Sailors fell ill before they could board ships. Hoplites weakened or died before they could join the phalanx. The outbreak disrupted military schedules, weakened morale, and left Athens vulnerable. Thucydides recorded that entire units were affected, with soldiers collapsing during campaigns or falling sick shortly after deployment. The disease also struck the lower classes who rowed the triremes, the essential backbone of Athenian naval power. Even when ships could be manned, the crews were often inexperienced or fewer in number. This reduced the effectiveness of the fleet, undermining Athens's key strategic advantage. Sparta, meanwhile, faced its own challenges. Fears of the disease spreading to their forces limited their movement in Attica. But the Spartans did not face the same level of crowding or international exposure as Athens. Their losses were lighter, allowing them to maintain steady pressure. The psychological impact was equally significant. Citizens who once viewed the war as a struggle for honor and influence now questioned its purpose. The plague made it difficult to sustain patriotic pride. While Pericles urged unity, the city's focus shifted toward basic survival. Military decisions became reactive rather than strategic. Some historians argue that without the plague, Athens might have maintained the momentum needed to negotiate favorable terms, or even end the war early. Instead, the city entered a prolonged conflict, weakened, divided, and deeply traumatized. The plague did not decide the war alone, but it altered its course in ways that shaped the fate of the Greek world. From the moment Thucydides recorded the symptoms, scholars across centuries have attempted to determine the identity of the Plague of Athens. His descriptions are remarkably detailed, offering one of the oldest clinical records in history. Yet the illness has eluded definitive classification. Modern researchers have proposed numerous theories, each aligning with some of the symptoms but none capturing the full picture. Typhus is one of the most widely supported candidates. Spread by lice in cramped, unsanitary environments, it matches the conditions in Athens during the early years of the war. Symptoms such as fever, rash, and delirium correspond closely to Thucydides' account. However, typhus does not fully explain certain features, such as the intense thirst or the high mortality among physicians. Smallpox has also been proposed. The disease causes fever, rash, and severe scarring, which could align with some descriptions. But Thucydides does not mention the characteristic pustules of smallpox, and the timeline of symptoms differs from what modern epidemiology suggests. Some scholars argue for a form of viral hemorrhagic fever, similar to Ebola, due to the rapid progression, internal heat, and high fatality rate. Yet such diseases typically require specific transmission routes and reservoir hosts that are difficult to reconcile with ancient Athens. More exotic theories include measles, anthrax, toxic shock syndrome, or even an extinct pathogen that left no descendants detectable today. Advances in DNA analysis have allowed researchers to examine ancient remains, but no conclusive samples from plague victims in Athens have been found. Thucydides himself avoided speculation. He focused on clear observation, writing that his account should enable future generations to recognize a similar outbreak if it occurred again. In doing so, he created a record that has challenged scientists, physicians, and historians for more than 2,000 years. The true identity of the Plague of Athens remains a mystery, adding another layer of complexity to its historical legacy. Amid the devastation, Thucydides observed a phenomenon that remains important in medical history. Survivors of the plague appeared to gain lasting immunity. Those who recovered from the illness were able to care for the sick without becoming infected again. This detail, noted by Thucydides with careful observation, makes the Plague of Athens one of the first recorded instances in which immunity to a disease was recognized. Survivors became invaluable to the city, with physicians dying in large numbers and many citizens too afraid to help others. Those who had lived through the illness stepped into critical roles. They tended to the sick, removed the dead, and helped restore some measure of order to overwhelmed households. Thucydides remarked that they acted with confidence, knowing they would not fall ill again. The experience of surviving the plague carried a psychological impact as well. Many felt a renewed sense of purpose or destiny. In a city where uncertainty dominated daily life, immunity offered rare clarity. Yet immunity did not erase the trauma. Survivors had witnessed the suffering of family members and neighbors, and many bore long-term physical effects. Thucydides noted that some lost their hair, eyesight, or extremities due to complications from the disease. Modern historians view these accounts as early evidence of the immune response. The recognition that recovery offered protection from reinfection predates scientific understanding by millennia. It also highlights the observational skill of Thucydides, whose record continues to provide insight into ancient disease patterns. Despite their resilience, survivors could not fully restore normalcy. Their immunity helped stabilize the city, but the larger social and economic losses remained. They stood among the fragments of a society forever changed, carrying the memory of catastrophe into the years that followed. After the initial outbreak subsided, Athens experienced a brief period of relief. Citizens began to hope that the worst had passed. The city attempted to restore some sense of normal life, reopening public spaces and re-establishing essential services. Military operations resumed, though on a reduced scale. But these efforts were short-lived. Within a few years, the plague returned. The second wave struck a population already weakened by earlier losses. Families that had survived the first outbreak now faced renewed terror. Many who had recovered retained immunity, but thousands who had escaped infection during the initial wave remained vulnerable. The disease advanced with similar symptoms and lethality, overwhelming Athens again. This resurgence occurred during a period of political instability following Pericles' death. New leaders struggled to coordinate an effective response. Public morale, already fragile, deteriorated further. The return of the disease also undermined the city's religious confidence. The earlier crisis of belief deepened as citizens grappled with the possibility that the gods had condemned Athens to repeated suffering. The second wave had significant military consequences. Athens continued to rely on its navy, but shortages of manpower became more pronounced. The city could not easily replace skilled rowers or experienced commanders. Even when ships could be deployed, morale was low, and fear of renewed outbreaks accompanied every campaign. Thucydides' account of the second wave is shorter than his description of the first, suggesting that the city had grown numb to disaster. The novelty of the illness had faded, replaced by a grim acceptance. The second wave did not reach the same catastrophic scale as the first, but it deepened the long-term damage to the city's population, economy, and political stability. For Athens, the return of the plague confirmed that the crisis was not an isolated event, but a recurring force that would shape the remainder of the war and the future of the city. The combined pressures of war and plague destabilized Athenian politics. With Pericles gone, new leaders emerged, each promoting different visions for the city's future. Some advocated aggressive military action to restore confidence and assert dominance. Others urged caution, seeking negotiated settlements or defensive strategies. The divided leadership reflected a population struggling to find direction. Cleon, a prominent politician known for his bold rhetoric, gained influence during this period. He pushed for more assertive tactics against Sparta and its allies, arguing that strength would secure Athens' survival. His approach led to some military successes, but critics viewed him as reckless and overly confrontational. The plague had eroded the city's capacity for measured decision-making, and public debates often grew heated. The democratic system, which relied on active participation from citizens, faced challenges as illness reduced attendance and disrupted civic routines. Strategic decisions were sometimes made by smaller groups or under emotional strain. The pressure of constant warfare and disease made it difficult to maintain the careful balance upon which Athenian democracy depended. Allies within the Delian League also sensed Athens' vulnerability. Some city-states resisted tribute obligations or rebelled outright. Suppressing these revolts required resources that Athens could ill afford to spare. Each rebellion strained the city further, both financially and militarily. Within Athens, economic inequality grew. The wealthy had more means to protect themselves and rebuild, while the poor suffered the brunt of the crisis. This widening divide intensified political tensions. Public trust in leadership eroded, and factions within the assembly competed for influence. Modern historians argue that the plague accelerated the decline of Athenian political stability. Decisions made during this period, shaped by fear and desperation, had long-lasting consequences. As the war dragged on, the city's internal divisions became increasingly pronounced. The plague had not only weakened Athens materially, but fractured its political cohesion, leaving it vulnerable to future missteps. The Plague of Athens left a profound mark on Greek culture and historical consciousness. While the physical consequences were visible in the city's population and infrastructure, the psychological and cultural impact persisted long after the outbreak ended. Literature, philosophy, and collective memory absorbed the event, shaping how later generations understood suffering, resilience, and the fragility of human society. Saban Kapoth. Thucydides' account served as the primary source for understanding the plague. His detailed, unembellished record influenced not only historians, but also writers and thinkers in later eras. Philosophers referencing the unpredictability of life often drew upon the events in Athens as an example of how fortune and fate could overturn the strongest of human designs. The tragedy also found echoes in drama. Athenian playwrights, already inclined to explore themes of suffering, justice, and divine will, incorporated references to plague and disease into their works. While not always direct commentary on the events, these references reflected the city's collective trauma. Euripides, for example, wrote tragedies during this period that convey a heightened sense of human vulnerability and existential uncertainty. In the centuries that followed, the Plague of Athens became a point of comparison for other outbreaks. Roman historians, medieval scholars, and modern researchers all looked to Thucydides when examining plagues in their own times. His account provided a framework for understanding how disease interacts with war, politics, and society. The event also shaped discussions about leadership and governance. Pericles' death and the political turmoil that followed illustrated the dangers of over-reliance on a single figure. The collapse of social norms demonstrated how quickly order can break down under extreme stress. For Athens, the cultural memory of the plague became intertwined with the story of its decline. Though the city continued to produce art, philosophy, and political innovation, the outbreak remained a defining moment, a reminder of both human vulnerability and the enduring power of historical testimony. When the plague finally subsided, Athens emerged into a difficult and uncertain recovery. The city had lost an enormous portion of its population, Estimates vary, but many historians believe that between a quarter and one-third of all Athenians died. The losses were felt in every part of society: citizens, slaves, metics, artisans, sailors, and soldiers. Entire families had vanished. Skilled trades suffered shortages. Neighborhoods were left with empty homes and fractured communities. Rebuilding required more than physical restoration. The emotional and psychological wounds were deep. Many citizens lived with grief, trauma, or survivor's guilt. Thucydides' writing captures this sense of numb endurance, describing how Athenians struggled to return to ordinary life even as the war continued. Public spaces that once hosted festivals and assemblies carried memories of suffering. Temples that had been filled with the sick were slowly cleansed and restored, though traces of the crisis lingered in the collective memory. Economically, the city faced strain. The loss of labor disrupted agriculture, construction, and naval operations. Refugees returning to rural Attica found their farms damaged or neglected after years of Spartan invasions. Trade continued through Piraeus, but the network of merchants and sailors had been weakened. Despite these setbacks, Athens attempted to reassert its status by continuing military campaigns and maintaining its empire. Social dynamics had shifted as well. With so many citizen deaths, the boundaries between social classes blurred. Metics and freed slaves took on greater responsibilities. Families restructured themselves around survivors, sometimes adopting new members or merging households for economic stability. Rebuilding Athens required resilience, adaptability, and a renewed sense of purpose. Yet the city moved forward not with the confidence it once held, but with the knowledge that its strength could be shaken by forces beyond its control. The plague had reshaped Athens, leaving it changed in ways that would influence its culture and politics for generations. Although Athens continued to fight the Peloponnesian War for more than 2 decades after the plague, the city was fundamentally weakened. Historians debate how much the outbreak contributed to its ultimate defeat, but most agree that the plague played a significant role in shifting the balance of power. The immediate losses were devastating. The death of Pericles removed a leader capable of restraining political extremes and guiding Athens with strategic clarity. His successors lacked his authority and long-term vision. Political decisions became more erratic, influenced by shifting factions and public frustration. The city's unity deteriorated as new leaders pursued bold or reckless strategies in an attempt to regain momentum. The reduction in population also affected military capabilities. Naval crews, hoplites, and rowers had been depleted. Athens still possessed a formidable fleet, but it struggled to maintain the same level of manpower and expertise. Repeated outbreaks and continuing warfare drained resources that might otherwise have strengthened the city's defenses. Economic disruption compounded these issues. The loss of laborers slowed production, while the cost of ongoing military campaigns strained the treasury. Tribute from the empire remained a vital resource, but enforcing it became more challenging as subject states sensed Athens' vulnerability. Thucydides noted that the plague changed the moral character of the city. The sense of shared civic duty that had once defined Athenian democracy weakened, replaced by fear, self-interest, and short-term thinking. This shift influenced decisions such as the Sicilian expedition, a bold but disastrous attempt to project power far beyond the Aegean. Many scholars argue that without the psychological and political destabilization caused by the plague, such a risky campaign might not have been approved. By the time Athens finally surrendered to Sparta in 404 BC, the city was exhausted. The plague did not single-handedly cause its defeat, but it undermined the foundations of Athenian power at a critical moment. The war revealed the limits of a system stretched beyond its capacity, weakened by disease, and divided by internal tensions. The Plague of Athens holds a unique place in history because of Thucydides' detailed account, yet it was not the only epidemic to shape the ancient world. Comparing the Athenian outbreak to other ancient plagues provides insight into how societies confronted similar challenges. Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Near Eastern records describe epidemics that disrupted kingdoms and armies. In many cases, disease spread along trade routes, following patterns similar to those that likely brought the plague to Athens. Crowded cities, limited sanitation, and reliance on river or maritime networks created ideal conditions for contagious illnesses. Like the Athenians, other ancient peoples interpreted outbreaks as divine punishment or omens of political change. The Roman world later experienced plagues that echoed the Athenian tragedy. The Antonine Plague of the 2nd century AD, possibly smallpox, devastated the empire's population and weakened its military strength. The Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century produced widespread social and religious upheaval. These events mirror earlier patterns, disease striking at moments of expansion or conflict, altering the trajectory of powerful civilizations. What sets the Athenian plague apart is the clarity of Thucydides' testimony. Rather than attributing the crisis solely to divine will, he offered a rational, observational approach. He described symptoms, patterns of spread, and the social consequences. His method foreshadowed later scientific approaches to epidemiology. Modern scholars often credit him with creating one of the earliest empirical accounts of disease in human history. By comparing the Athenian plague with other ancient outbreaks, historians see recurring themes. Disease exploits weaknesses in social structures, emerges through networks of travel and trade, and often strikes hardest in times of conflict. The human responses, fear, resilience, moral questioning, and adaptation, reveal shared patterns across cultures and eras. The Plague of Athens, therefore, is both a unique historical event and part of a broader human experience. Its legacy provides insight not only into the ancient Greek world, but into the ways societies across history have confronted the invisible forces that shape their destiny. Though separated by more than 2 millennia, the Plague of Athens offers insights that remain relevant today. Thucydides wrote his account not only to document the event, but to help future generations recognize similar patterns should they arise again. His observations reveal how disease can test the resilience of a society, challenge its institutions, and expose underlying vulnerabilities. One of the clearest parallels is the relationship between population density and disease spread. Athens became vulnerable because it condensed its entire rural population within the city walls. Modern cities face similar risks, with dense urban centers often hit hardest by outbreaks. The Athenian experience shows how strategic decisions, however necessary in wartime, can unintentionally create conditions that magnify disease. The crisis also highlights the importance of leadership. Pericles' death left Athens without stable direction at a pivotal moment. The plague revealed how fragile political systems can become when key figures are removed suddenly. Modern societies, too, depend on continuity of leadership and resilient institutions capable of responding to sudden shocks. Thucydides' description of social breakdown resonates strongly with contemporary experiences of crisis. Fear, isolation, and uncertainty strained Athenian society in ways that feel familiar today. Yet he also recorded examples of compassion, courage, and the willingness of some survivors to help others. This duality, fear and resilience, remains a constant aspect of human behavior in the face of disaster. Another lesson lies in the value of accurate record-keeping. Without Thucydides, the Plague of Athens might have faded into myth. His commitment to evidence and clarity provides future generations with a window into the past and a tool for understanding their own challenges. Modern historians and scientists continue to study his account as a foundational text in the history of epidemiology. The Plague of Athens reminds us that disease does not operate in isolation. It interacts with politics, economics, psychology, and culture. Understanding these connections allows societies to prepare more effectively for future crises. Thucydides' message remains clear. The human response to disaster is as important as the disaster itself. The Plague of Athens remains one of the most vividly recorded disasters of the ancient world. It arrived silently, flourished under the pressures of war, and reshaped a city that had once stood at the height of its power. Through Thucydides' account, we witness not only the physical devastation but the emotional and moral upheaval that accompanied it. Athens endured the outbreak, but it emerged changed. The loss of life, the collapse of social customs, the weakening of political unity, and the erosion of confidence all contributed to a gradual decline that influenced the remainder of the Peloponnesian War. The city's identity, rooted in democracy, innovation, and cultural pride, was tested in ways its citizens had never imagined. Yet the legacy of the plague is not solely one of destruction. It also reveals the resilience of human communities. Survivors rebuilt their neighborhoods, restored temples, revived trade, and continued to participate in civic life. The cultural achievements of Athens did not end with the plague. The city continued to produce art, literature, and ideas that shaped the ancient world. Thucydides' decision to record the event with such clarity ensured that the memory of the plague would endure. His work allows us to understand the suffering and determination of those who lived through it. His account bridges the gap between ancient and modern worlds, showing how societies confront challenges that test their foundations. In the end, the Plague of Athens stands as a reminder of both vulnerability and endurance. It demonstrates how disease can alter the course of history, and how the human response to crisis can reveal strengths and weaknesses within a society. The echoes of the plague continue to resonate, offering insight into the timeless struggle between human ambition, the forces of nature, and the unpredictable challenges that shape civilizations. Thanks for listening to this tale of history.